James Anderson arrived at Pine Lake Estates not with celebration, but with a quiet weight of memory. His grandfather's passing had left him with more than just a will. He had inherited a legacy. The lakeside cabin, perched on a sloping edge of pine and stone, had stood for nearly 70 years. Built during the post-war era by his grandfather's own hands, it was a structure steeped in wood grain, iron hinges, and stubbornness. The boards creaked with history, not disrepair. The porch swing still hung, weathered but sound, and the wooden sign over the doorway still read, "Stillwater." James had no illusions about what lay ahead. He had grown up spending summers here, long sun-soaked days fishing off the dock, reading Mark Twain under the rafters, and helping his grandfather oil the hinges of trap doors and service tunnels no one else seemed to know about. But now, returning as a man in his early 40s, a city professional burned out from legal consulting and urban life, he had hoped for peace. He didn't expect a war, not so soon. Victoria Jenkins was waiting, or rather, her voice was, before her face. The first envelope appeared within 2 days of his arrival, a formally worded notice of violation, citing noncompliance with Pine Lake Estates HOA guidelines. The offense? Unregistered restoration work in a high-visibility zone, which James soon discovered referred to his repainting of the original cabin shutters. He'd chosen the exact same shade of forest green his grandfather had used for decades. But that didn't matter to Victoria. The rules had changed. Victoria Jenkins was the kind of person who mistook rules for morality and power for responsibility. Blonde, sharply dressed, always speaking in clipped tones and passive-aggressive pleasantries, she had become HOA President only 2 years prior. In that time, she had reshaped the community in her image: cookie-cutter perfection, architectural conformity, and zero tolerance for deviation. Her rulebook was longer than the actual HOA charter, and she wielded it like a blade. James wasn't surprised when the second letter came, followed by a knock at the door. It was Victoria, flanked by 2 other board members with clipboards and tight expressions. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that belonged to a poker player, not a neighbor. "We need to talk about your cabin," she said. James let them in. He offered coffee. They declined. Victoria pulled out a list and began walking the property like a realtor sizing up a foreclosure. Everything she mentioned seemed absurd. The vintage water pump wasn't aesthetically consistent. The roof shingles weren't updated to 2021 storm standards. The weather vane was ornamental without board approval. When James finally interrupted, asking if she realized the cabin was officially listed on the county's historic property register, she blinked, then smiled wider. "That's irrelevant," she said. "This is Pine Lake Estates, Mr. Anderson. We have standards, and those apply to all properties, no exceptions." James didn't argue. He let them finish their inspection, then watched them walk off toward their perfectly paved road of identically repainted homes. But in his mind, a clock had started ticking. He knew he wasn't just facing nitpicking. This was pressure. A push. They wanted him out. The whispers started soon after. Comments from neighbors during morning walks. Stilted greetings, eyes averting. Some said nothing. Others hinted at Victoria's vision for the neighborhood: new developments, lakefront condos, golf access. The old properties, like James's, were underperforming assets. Rumor had it she'd already received offers from developers contingent on clearing out older structures that didn't match the aesthetic plan. James's cabin wasn't just non-compliant, it was in the way, but Victoria hadn't done her homework. James wasn't a retiree without options. He had worked for over a decade in legal consulting, specializing in land use policy and property law. He knew every word of his grandfather's deed, had already pulled zoning maps and council minutes before arriving. He quietly requested records from the county planning department and was already aware that Pine Lake Estates had no jurisdiction over structures listed on the Regional Historical Register. His grandfather had applied for and secured that status nearly 15 years ago, but James didn't confront her right away. He knew how this game was played. Paper first, then pressure. So he waited. More letters came, each more aggressive. Threats of escalating fines. Notices of non-compliance. A scheduled emergency board hearing regarding his violations. But what startled James wasn't the tone. It was the evidence of surveillance. Some photos attached to the letters showed angles from within his own property line. Someone had been entering the land without permission. He installed cameras, quietly, professionally, hidden in eaves, mounted in birdhouses, one tucked beneath the dock ladder. And over the next few weeks, the footage confirmed his suspicions. HOA members, sometimes Victoria herself, had been entering his property, photographing details, inspecting things without notice or consent. One clip showed Victoria trying to open a service hatch near the crawl space. She struggled, cursed under her breath, then walked away. James started gathering his own file. He printed stills, filed timestamps, kept logs of every letter and interaction. Then he turned to the cabin itself. His grandfather, ever the eccentric builder, had designed the place with peculiarities, hatches, latches, pressure-sensitive paths that could lock doors automatically if you didn't know the sequence. James had always seen them as charming quirks. Now he realized they were tactical advantages. Without causing harm or violating any laws, he could make the property extremely difficult to navigate for uninvited guests. And so he did. Unauthorized visitors began encountering jammed gates, stuck doors, slippery gravel paths, and in one case, a motion-triggered sprinkler system that drenched a board member trying to photograph a back window. James said nothing. He simply reviewed the footage, logged the incidents, and kept building his case. Then came the turning point. Victoria scheduled a full HOA hearing, not in their usual clubhouse, but in a private space rented at a nearby country club. She sent formal summons to James, and even distributed flyers to the neighborhood suggesting that a member's conduct was threatening the aesthetic and legal integrity of the community. James showed up with a folder. The room was packed. Residents, most of them silent, watched Victoria deliver a prepared statement about rule violations, neighborhood value depreciation, and the importance of enforcing compliance uniformly. She was poised, rehearsed. Then James stood. He didn't raise his voice. He simply opened his folder and began to speak. He laid out the legal history of the cabin, its grandfathered status, its placement on the county historic registry, its legal independence from HOA structural control. He passed copies of documents around the room. Then, he played the security footage, muted, respectful, but clear. Multiple members trespassing. Victoria opening a crawl space. Unauthorized surveillance. Then he dropped the final piece. The maps. Using archive zoning maps and easement records, James showed that the HOA clubhouse and a portion of the marina, both frequently used as amenities to justify increased HOA fees, were built partially on land that technically belonged to his family's estate. His grandfather had never sold it, only leased it informally decades ago. Gasps filled the room. James didn't threaten eviction. He didn't demand demolition. He simply said, "This land has memory. I'm only here to protect it." Victoria tried to push back, calling it a technicality, but the damage was done. The board faltered. Residents, many of whom had privately endured similar harassment, began speaking up. Questions were asked. A petition was circulated. Within 2 weeks, Victoria was voted out of office. What followed wasn't revenge. It was reform. James didn't ask for the marina to be torn down. He negotiated a formal lease agreement instead, one that ensured any profits went to maintenance and public good, not board salaries or secret development deals. A new HOA board was elected, with an open charter and community oversight. Historical properties, like James's, were granted special consideration and exemption pathways. But most importantly, the neighborhood changed. People stopped whispering and started talking. Older residents invited James to dinner. Younger families asked about volunteering for lake cleanup. The lines that once divided old from new, rule enforcers from homeowners, began to blur. James kept the cabin just as it was, green shutters, rusted weather vane, creaky floorboards and all. And for the first time in years, Stillwater felt still again. Peace, as James quickly realized, wasn't something you win once. It had to be maintained, nurtured, and, sometimes, defended again in new ways. With Victoria Jenkins removed from the HOA presidency, and the tide turning in his favor, James thought the hardest days might be behind him. But power, once broken, doesn't simply vanish. It searches for new hosts. In the weeks following Victoria's ousting, her absence was as loud as her presence had once been. The community was in flux. Some residents, those who had benefited from her authoritarian style, or who simply preferred order over discussion, felt uneasy. Others, long silenced or ignored, began to step forward. James, somewhat unintentionally, became a rallying point. He hadn't planned to get involved beyond his own property. But when members of the interim HOA board approached him, asking for input on rewriting the community guidelines, he agreed to consult. What began as a few recommendations turned into a full review of the bylaws, fee structures, and architectural restrictions that had long been used as weapons instead of guidelines. James pushed for clarity and fairness. The rewritten charter included a special exemption process for historic properties, caps on fines without independent mediation, and a new clause ensuring that all board actions be subject to open community voting. He introduced a concept he called informed autonomy, the idea that residents should have the freedom to shape their homes within broad, respectful guidelines, rather than being forced into rigid conformity. It wasn't just legalese. It was philosophy. People responded. The community started holding regular open forums, not just for complaints, but for ideas. A neighbor named Claudia proposed turning the previously exclusive lakefront clubhouse into a shared space for all residents, with room for art exhibitions, reading circles, and community dinners. Another resident, Mr. Patel, volunteered to run a weekly woodworking workshop out of his garage, inviting teens and retirees alike. The HOA wasn't just healing, it was evolving. But not everyone welcomed the changes. A small faction of former board loyalists began circulating anonymous flyers warning of historical favoritism and chaos disguised as freedom. They accused James of undermining property values, even as listings in Pine Lake Estates began climbing in interest and price. When the county real estate blog featured a glowing piece on the transformation of the community, titled, "Heritage Meets Harmony, Pine Lake Reinvents the HOA Model," opposition voices only grew louder, though fewer in number. Then, the media came calling. A local reporter who had been following the HOA dispute showed up at James's door with a camera crew. He was polite, persistent, and surprisingly well-informed. The story he told in the following week's broadcast was not just about James. It was about how one resident's resistance had sparked a legal and cultural reckoning in a community that had, until recently, sleepwalked through governance. The piece was picked up nationally. Overnight, James's inbox filled with messages. Emails from homeowners in Arizona, Georgia, Minnesota, all telling variations of the same story. Abuse of power, arbitrary fines, harassment by board presidents who treated HOA positions like personal kingdoms. Some asked for legal advice, others just wanted to know how to begin standing up. James answered every message he could. When the volume became overwhelming, he created a small website, preservewithpurpose.org, to share resources, model charters, and guides for navigating HOA law. He published redacted versions of his grandfather's property exemption paperwork, a breakdown of the loopholes Victoria had used, and a simple document titled, 10 Things Your HOA Doesn't Want You to Know. It went viral. Even as James tried to keep his focus local, the scope of his influence expanded. Invitations came in, virtual summits, podcasts, even a legal symposium in Sacramento focused on private governance in residential communities. James declined most at first. He wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity. But when a state senator's office reached out asking him to testify during a committee hearing on proposed HOA transparency legislation, he felt an old sense of purpose stirring. He had spent his early professional years analyzing land use law. Now he had lived its flaws firsthand. In Sacramento, James was calm, articulate, and piercingly clear. He explained how easily power can be centralized when a board is allowed to operate in the shadows. He shared how fines were being used as de facto taxes, how architectural review boards were enforcing aesthetic homogeneity in violation of property rights, and how intimidation, often subtle, sometimes overt, had replaced neighborly cooperation in communities across the state. The hearing chamber was full. Legislators asked pointed questions, some skeptical, others shocked. James answered without drama, without bitterness. Just facts. A week later, the proposed bill, tentatively named the Homeowners Oversight and Protection Act, was officially introduced, with bipartisan support. The bill aimed to establish a public database of HOA governing documents, require annual audits for HOAs exceeding 100 residents, and mandate third-party mediation before fines could be enforced. Back in Pine Lake, word of James's testimony spread quickly. For the most part, people were proud. Several neighbors hosted a modest celebration at the lakeside picnic area. Someone brought a homemade cake that read, "Our HOA MVP." James laughed, took photos, and then slipped away early. He was grateful, but tired. The spotlight had never suited him. Meanwhile, consequences continued to unfold for Victoria Jenkins. After her removal, a deeper look into the HOA's financial records revealed troubling inconsistencies. An independent audit confirmed that funds allocated for clubhouse expansion and security infrastructure had, in part, been funneled into private accounts linked to a real estate LLC, an LLC that listed Victoria as a silent partner. The developer connection James had suspected was real. Local authorities began building a case, and by early winter, formal charges were filed. Fraud, misappropriation of community funds, and unlawful conflict of interest. Victoria didn't return to Pine Lake after that. Her house was quietly sold. Rumors swirled that she had moved out of state. James didn't dwell on it. He held no malice, only relief. With her gone and accountability in motion, the space to rebuild had become wide open. One afternoon, a group of high school students reached out asking to interview James for a class project on civic responsibility. When they arrived, clipboards, cameras, and eager questions in hand, they expected stories of courtroom drama and power struggles. Instead, James walked them through the cabin. He showed them old photographs, shared the story of his grandfather building the place, and talked about what it meant to live with patience, preparedness, and principle. "This house," he said, "stood for 70 years before any of you were born. Not because it was modern or efficient or code compliant, but because it was built with intention. That's what we're trying to build again, intention, not intimidation." The students stayed longer than planned. They left with handshakes and a new understanding of the connection between personal integrity and community resilience. And the cabin? It stood as always, unchanged and unchanging in its essence. Stillwater had never been just a name. It was a truth. By the end of that year, Pine Lake had become a case study for several urban policy programs. A graduate student from Stanford came to shadow James and document the post-reform era. A short documentary followed, screened at a regional housing equity conference. James, watching it from the back of a dim theater, saw his grandfather's cabin on the big screen, framed by sunset and pines, and felt something stir deep in his chest: gratitude for the place, for the people, for the fact that when power threatened legacy, someone had chosen to stand rather than step aside. The first snowfall of the year came early to Pine Lake, dusting the tree branches in silver and tracing white across the rooftop of the Anderson cabin. Stillwater stood strong, exactly as it had for decades, its green shutters closed against the cold, and its chimney breathing slow plumes into the frosty air. Inside, James Anderson sat by the fire, a mug of black coffee in one hand, reviewing pages of legal drafts and annotated community proposals sent from half a dozen different states. He never imagined this would be his life. What had started as a battle over porch shutters and a historic designation had become a national conversation. The Pine Lake story, his story, was now being used in HOA seminars, property law lectures, and reform summits. Advocacy groups began citing the Anderson precedent to describe how local governance structures, like HOAs, needed to be reined in by both the law and by residents standing their ground. He wasn't just a cabin owner anymore. He had become something of a symbol, not by choice, but by necessity. And yet, he still woke up each morning to tend to the same things: sweeping the porch, checking the lake levels, refilling the bird feeder. It was this daily rhythm that kept him grounded. No matter how wide the impact of his efforts grew, James remained connected to the soil, the boards, the path beneath his feet. His fight had never been about fame. It had been about preservation, of land, of truth, of legacy. In the spring, James was invited to speak at a federal advisory panel on private residential governance. For the first time, he traveled to Washington, D.C., not as a guest, but as a key stakeholder. The room was filled with housing advocates, lawyers, state officials, and HUD representatives. James stood in front of the room and, rather than quoting statutes, he told a story, the story of a quiet cabin, a determined man, and a community that found its way back to itself. 1 week after the panel, a bipartisan bill was introduced to Congress, the Community Oversight and Homeowner Equity Act. It proposed national standards for HOA transparency, mandated oversight boards in every state, capped fine limits, and protected historically designated properties from arbitrary aesthetic enforcement. James wasn't listed as an author, but several provisions had come directly from his experience. Back at Pine Lake, the community continued to flourish. The new HOA board, now comprised of a diverse group of volunteers, implemented open budgets, quarterly audits, and anonymous complaint mediations overseen by third-party professionals. Instead of secret meetings, all decisions were posted in a shared online forum. Architectural guidelines were simplified, focusing on safety and sustainability instead of rigid visual conformity. James didn't run for office. He didn't need to. The work had taken root. On the cabin wall hung a framed photograph of his grandfather standing on the porch, sleeves rolled up, holding a paintbrush in one hand and a mug in the other. Below the photo, James had mounted a small plaque that simply read, "He built it. I protected it." He still received letters, now more than ever. One came from a single mother in Nevada who had faced fines for painting her fence without board approval. After using the documents on James's website, she discovered the board had exceeded its authority and had her case dismissed. Another came from a retired veteran in South Carolina who had used James's HOA template to negotiate the removal of predatory fines that had nearly cost him his home. They didn't ask for anything. They simply thanked him. And every so often James would host visitors, journalists, students, lawyers, even small-town mayors. They'd sit on his porch, ask questions, take notes. He always offered coffee. He always asked them to walk with him down to the dock. He believed that the truth of what they were building couldn't be understood from a PowerPoint. It had to be felt in the quiet, in the way the wind moved across the water, in the way Stillwater stood as both a place and a principle. Then came the local school district's proposal. Pine Lake Middle School wanted to add a new curriculum module focused on civic responsibility and community law. The teachers asked James if he would consider helping them create a local case study. He agreed, but under one condition. The project had to focus on the community, not him. The students interviewed neighbors, documented the evolution of HOA rules, and wrote essays on the balance between individuality and collective responsibility. On presentation day, James was invited to the school. He sat in the front row as seventh graders gave short speeches, held up posters of the Pine Lake timeline, and even presented a miniature model of Stillwater cabin made from cardboard and recycled wood. At the end, one girl stood up and read aloud a letter. "Dear Mr. Anderson, because of you, we learned that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it just means not moving when someone tells you to. Your cabin helped us understand history, but your story helped us understand courage." James didn't say much afterward. He simply walked the halls in quiet awe, marveling at how deeply a simple act of resistance had rippled outward into lessons, laws, and lives. Months later, Pine Lake was nominated for a State Civic Renewal Award, an honor given to communities that demonstrate significant improvement in governance, unity, and preservation. The committee asked James to accept it on behalf of the residents. He politely declined and suggested Rosa Bellington instead, a longtime resident who had once feared speaking out during Victoria's rule and now chaired the community planning group. Rosa stood on stage and told the room, "We didn't change because one man stood up. We changed because we remembered how to stand together." By the end of that year, something incredible had happened. Pine Lake Estates had gone from a cautionary tale to a national model. Other communities began copying its hybrid framework: respect for legacy, clear legal boundaries, voluntary participation, and collective ownership of decisions. James had become a quiet consultant to other historic communities across the country, helping them file for designations, establish exemptions, and push back legally against exploitative governance. He even began writing a book, not a political manifesto, but a narrative reflection titled Stillwater: What One Cabin Taught Me About Standing My Ground. It included stories from his grandfather's life, the quirks of the cabin, and the moral lessons woven through every board meeting and late-night letter. The book went on to become a regional bestseller. It was picked up by public libraries across the country and assigned reading in some university-level property law courses. One professor called it a case study in ethics dressed up as a personal essay. That was exactly what James had hoped for. In the final chapter he wrote, "Some places are not just real estate. They are memory and meaning and blood. When those places are threatened by the coldness of paperwork or the greed of unchecked power, it falls on us not to fight blindly, but to stand wisely. It's not the loudest who win. It's the prepared, the principled, and the patient." Stillwater continued to stand. The final scene of that year came in the form of a gathering, an informal Pine Lake Legacy Night, hosted on the edge of the lake. There were fire pits, live acoustic music, and a giant screen showing photos of the neighborhood through the decades. Toward the end of the evening, as the stars came out and the lake reflected their quiet shimmer, someone handed James the microphone. He stood, looked out over the faces of neighbors and friends, and said simply, "I didn't save this place. We did. And I hope we keep saving it every single day." The crowd applauded. Children ran across the grass. Somewhere, a loon called out over the water. And as James sat back down on his bench near the fire, someone placed a sunflower in a vase beside him. And no one had to say what it meant. He smiled.